Welcome to our lecture on the book of Genesis. It is the first book of the Bible sacred to Jews and Christians in particular. Genesis itself is part of a group of 5 books called the Torah for Jews and the Pentateuch for Christians. I want to frame this introductory meditation on the work in terms of the question, what if the story of our lives belongs to an all-encompassing story? That is, can we think of the meaning that we're trying to draw together in our lives, our years here on earth, as part of an ongoing story that is running in and through what we are undergoing, enduring sometimes? What is this life about? Is it part of something bigger? In the book of Genesis, we see that this is very much the view, that the whole history of the world is part of a project on the part of the Creator God. And that we think of the word providence, that there is a direction and a guiding of our lives by this transcendent deity. So that's the question. Would it change how we live our lives? We ask that question, how should we live? Would it change how we answer that question if we were to hypothesize providence, that there might be some other factor involved in history other than our own plans? Well, we can try out this theory by reading this monumental piece of literature. We don't have to be believers we don't have to be Jews or Christians or Muslims to look at this work and feel as if there's something powerful and compelling to it. Let's test out this theory. Let's read it and try to understand why this has had such force in the history of the world as a piece of writing. The book itself is divided into 2 large sections. Chapters 1 through 11 is filled with mythically based, legendary material. We will talk a little bit more precisely about the creation stories at the beginning, but the story of the flood, and for instance, is part of this material. There are debates amongst Christians about how literal to take these things, but it is clear that the genre of the material is legendary. It's very important for the reading of Scripture to understand that different books have different kinds of genre. And understanding the rules of the game, as it were, helps us to understand the meaning that's being communicated. So chapters 1 to 11, which talk about the history of everything, history of the world, the civilization, of the predicament that we are in, the fall, as we call it. The last part of the book, which is the largest part, chapters 12 to 50, is a history of the people of Israel. It's the patriarchal history. It's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. The last long section is Joseph. We'll only be treating up through chapter 22. 12 to 22 is the story of Abraham. So he's called out of Mesopotamia. So we've already talked with the Epic of Gilgamesh about the origins of civilization in Mesopotamia. Well, Abraham comes from that region, and he's called into this land of Canaan, this land of hardscrabble, independent city-states, to make a different kind of life. So to maybe, bring civilization to a new area, to amplify civilization. We have to track his story to try to understand what that movement might mean. It's probably worth having a brief overview of the history of Israel in our minds as we're looking at this material. So there's the Pre-Monarchic Period before the king Saul, David, Solomon that we know of. From 1400 to 1020, if we put Abraham, and there's not a complete agreement on this, but let's put Abraham in the 1400s. From that to the accession of Saul to the kingship in 1020, we have the Pre-Monarchic Period. So this is when the tribes of Israel are still living more or less independent political lives. It's under the kingship of Saul that there's a consolidation enough for them, for instance, to resist the overlordship of the Philistines. So the monarchic period starts with Saul, It reaches its grandeur under David and Solomon. That's from 1000 to 930 when you have the United Kingdom. The monarchic period runs from 1020, the beginning of Saul's reign, all the way to 586, which is the destruction of the southern kingdom. So in between, we have the destruction of the northern kingdom in 721. That is, after the death of Solomon, the tribes divide up again. 9 tribes form a northern kingdom in 930, and then the 3 southern tribes form the kingdom of Judah. That northern tribe is destroyed by the kingdom of Syria in 721. The people are deported, and we lose the northern kingdom as a unified body. The southern kingdom persists for a century and a half more, and the exile, though, begins with the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom in 586. That Babylonian, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire, is itself displaced by an empire that we're going to see a lot of in this semester, and that's the Persian Empire. So under Cyrus, the Persians repatriate the Jews, the people of the southern kingdom, in 538, and they set about then to rebuild the temple which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. So we can talk about the last part of biblical Israelite history in 2 ways. The Persian period, beginning under Cyrus, would run from 538 to 333. That date 333 is very important because that's when Alexander the Great takes over. So that's very important. We'll see it again when some power outside of the ancient Near East comes in and takes over the ancient Near East. That's the significance of the date 333. The ancient world kind of comes to an end then. Overlapping this is a designation of the Second Temple period, which begins with the rebuilding of the temple in 516 and runs all the way to the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70 by the Romans. So these are important dates to kind of have in one's mind. Okay, let's turn back again to the beginning part of Genesis, especially the first 2 chapters, which there are 2 creation stories in the book of Genesis. The first chapter is cosmocentric. It's the famous part that talks about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we have the 6 days of creation. And there you have it leading up to the creation of man, male and female, humanity. Genesis 2 starts with the creation of man. And so it's anthropocentric. There's no reason to think of 1 and 2 as opposed to each other. They're in fact giving us 2 different viewpoints on the same reality. So you can think of the context in which humanity operates, that's Genesis 1, or you can start with putting your focus on humanity, and that is Genesis 2. And we have there the creation of Adam right off the bat, naming the animals and so on. And then the necessary creation of a partner in the great project of what's civilizing the world, maybe. So that's Genesis 2. Both of these creation stories are they're a riff on the preceding Mesopotamian mythologies. The later theological notion of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, that's not really there right in the text. It can be made to fit in there, but it's not what you have. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, right? So there's a chaos, a primeval chaos out of which order is to be brought forth with much effort. And humanity is part of that story. The God of Israel is wanting help, our partnership in bringing order out of chaos. That's a theodicy. That is, it's a way of trying to understand the fact that in this world, even though there's a good God, there's all of this unjust suffering and death, right? So why is that the case? Well, there's some recalcitrant chaos that has to be wrestled. But even though that's a riff off of the older Mesopotamian mythology, let's take a look at a preeminent example of the Mesopotamian mythology and see how they're different too. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation epic. It is a very crucial testimony to the worldview of the Mesopotamians. You have there a political mythology that is an account of the accession of a new god to the head of the pantheon, of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Again, the Mesopotamia includes many different peoples. You've got Sumerians, you've got Akkadians, you've got Babylonians and Assyrians. So the gods of all of these different peoples, when the Babylonians first take over, well before the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when the Babylonians under Hammurabi of the famous code takes over the Mesopotamian region, this is after Sargon and his conquests had started the imperial ball rolling. In the 18th century BC, the Babylonian control of Mesopotamia meant that the Babylonian gods would be at the forefront. And so Marduk, their high god, there has to be a story explaining why Marduk is at the head. And that's what you get in the Enuma Elish. In that story, you've got Marduk combating Tiamat, a goddess, who is the symbol of chaos, who is the goddess of salt water as opposed to sweet, fresh water, the life-giving water. She takes the form of a dragon. Marduk kills her and then creates the world out of her body. It's a story of creation out of violence. It is a story of creation out of divine need, because then humanity is created out of this, as part of this, the whole process, and is created to serve the gods, to take care of and feed the gods. Well, even though Genesis is riffing off of that, the differences are very profound there. In Genesis, God is wrestling order out of chaos, but he is not in any way in need of human sacrifice to be fed. There is no violence. God says what he wants to be, and it is. So he speaks. There's a logos, a word. It's not violent. So it's important to see the mythological background, to see that Genesis is part of that, but also that gives us a sense of how deeply different this story is. Okay, so what you have in Genesis, there's no sexual melodrama. There's no ambiguity to the goodness of God. God is just good, and he creates good things. And what that good God wants to do is to create visible goodness with the help of humans. And there's a divine-human partnership here, intimacy, in the form of covenants. And that's going to go all through Scripture, is these covenants. When Genesis is written, you see that there's a background of other gods. So it's, as the scriptural worldview develops, it goes from an absolute insistence on worship of one God, monolatry, and it develops into monotheism, an ethical monotheism, which is very clear, at least by the 8th century prophets like Amos, but it's absolutely clear by the time you get to Isaiah. Ethical monotheism means that this one God of this little people in this middling little area, Canaan, says that he will bring justice to other nations, greater nations, just far superior powers, because they have done wrong to other human beings. And so this, in a world where gods are seen to be part of a territory, part of a certain political structure, this little people's God claims a universal sovereignty. The standard account still of the composition of Genesis goes back to what is called the documentary hypothesis, where you have in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, 4 sources that have been extrapolated supposedly: the J, E, D, and P sources, the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly. 3 of those would be relevant according to this hypothesis in the construction of the text of Genesis: the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly. I think it's better to read the book of Genesis not in terms of this very, very shaky theory, in terms of literary unity. For one thing, the ancient reader was able to contain tension and even contradictions in a way that we're not very comfortable with doing. We want to have everything reduced to a flat timeline and everything just make pellucid sense. The poetic sensibility, which is a more ancient sensibility, is able to encompass different valences and great ambiguity. And so if a story has one line that seems to contradict with another, it doesn't necessarily mean that the story wasn't written by one author. That's one thing to keep in mind. And if we look at that story then, to enter into this reading thinking, is this a text that has power to shape how I look at my own life and what story might be running through my life, right? Is there some kind of intrinsic pathos when I read this? I'm not reading it, Genesis 1, as a textbook on cosmology. I'm trying to be moved by a poetic sensibility that is saying, this is the story of the world. And do I find myself in there? When I read about Abraham being called from a familiar place into a strange territory, can I see the trajectory of my life? Can I ask the question, how should we live in a way that makes more sense if I keep in mind that there's a possible providential arc to my life? In any case, that's the kind of story that Genesis puts before us, and it might be worth our time to entertain that as a serious possibility.